Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled Understanding the FCC's Reassigned Numbers Database. The R&D is a major development under the TCPA that affects companies across the country. Historically, there's been a good source of permanently disconnected landlines, but not of wireless or voice over IP numbers. So as landline use decreases and mobile use increases, this has become a big problem for callers to legally conduct business over the phone. I'm Eric Tejeda with Possible Now, and we are joined today by Kevin Mayfield, managing consultant from our sister company, Compliance Point, and he's here to discuss the R&D. And Danny Hitt, Vice President of Sales from Possible Now, is here to discuss our recommendations for compliance. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session to answer your specific questions. However, feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the presentation in the chat box. And as a housekeeping note, we will be sending out the PowerPoint at the end of the webinar. With that, Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks for that, Eric. I think probably most folks on the call today understand what the TCPA is and what's required under it, but I thought I'd just do a quick recap here. So the TCPA, as most people know, have been around since about 1991. It was really designed to stop unwanted telemarketing and other auto-dialed calls to consumers. And those rules were further bolstered in 2013. So just starting out here, there's two types of consent that may be needed, depending on what types of calls that you're making and the type of dialing equipment that you're using. The first we'll talk about is express written consent. So valid express written consent is obtained when you use a very specific disclosure that is clear and conspicuous to the consumer, that you're going to be calling them with, auto-dialed technology or pre-recorded messages and so forth. And then that is subsequently agreed to by the consumer separately from any other agreements. So it can't be buried inside of a larger, application or things of that nature. So express written consent is going to be required for telemarketing calls to cell phones anytime you're using a system that might be deemed an automatic telephone dialing system by definition under the TCPA. It's also needed if you're going to send pre-recorded messages that are marketing in nature to either mobile phones or landlines. The second type of consent we talk about is express consent. So the FCC has opined and said that valid express consent is obtained anytime that you receive a consumer's telephone number from that consumer during the normal course of business with no instructions to the contrary. So there shouldn't be any limitations on when you're getting that phone number from the consumer on how you're going to be using it. So you shouldn't say things like, hey, give us your phone number for identification purposes, for example. If you just simply ask for their phone number, they give it to you, then you can deem that as valid express consent. And express consent is going to be required for automated informational calls and pre-recorded messages to cell phones. So we'll talk a little bit about what is the reassigned number database. So as Eric mentioned earlier, there's historically been a very good source of permanently disconnected landlines, but there had not been, prior to the R&D's existence, good source of information for permanently disconnected wireless and VoIP numbers. So the TRACED Act was passed about 2 years ago now, and it required the FCC to report back to Congress within a year as to the status of the reassigned number database. At around that time, the FCC named Somos.gov as the company responsible for administering the R&D, and they'll be in charge of it for a period of 5 years. The name of the R&D is a little bit of a misnomer. The reassigned number database is a little bit misleading. It doesn't tell you when a number has been reassigned, but rather when a number has been permanently disconnected. So you can work under the assumption that if it's been permanently disconnected, it will soon be reassigned. So as far as a little bit of historical data on this, the large wireless carriers were required to begin tracking permanent disconnections about the middle of the year in 2020, and then smaller carriers were required to begin tracking in January of 2021. So there is a safe harbor if you utilize the reassigned number database. So the FCC has said that if you check the database and you receive a no response, and we'll talk a little bit about what a no response means in a later slide, but if you receive a no response and then subsequently make that call and you receive that no response in error, then you can seek safe harbor under the law. So in order to seek safe harbor, though, you got to have records, right? You got to have records of what you did. And if you don't have records, then as far as the FCC is concerned, it never happened. So it's important to understand that when you utilize the R&D, there's not going to be any historical records maintained for you of your queries against the database. So you're going to have to be forced to come up with your own record keeping as it relates to your R&D queries. So how does it work? So there's two different account types with the R&D. You're either a caller or a caller agent. I would think that most of the folks on the call today are probably callers, and that is just really a person or an entity that is initiating telephone calls to consumers, right? They also have caller agents, which are kind of third-party contractors that callers can then contract with to query the database on their behalf. But again, I think that most of you all are likely callers. So the R&D is not really like any DNC or wireless list that we're used to seeing. So unlike the national and state DNC lists and wireless lists that are out there, there is no list to download with the R&D. It's a database that's maintained that you're going to query with two different pieces of information, and that is a telephone number and the date that you received the consent on that telephone number, or the date that you're last reasonably sure that number belonged to that person. So in other words, you received consent on that number 2 years ago. Last month, they called in, made an inbound call to you, and you verified that that telephone number is still their number, then that would become your new date that you could use to query the R&D. So when you query the R&D with those two pieces of information, you're either going to get a yes or a no data response, right? So the yes is telling you that number has been permanently disconnected since the date you provided, and it should not be called. A no response indicates that the number has not been permanently disconnected since the date you provided and is callable, and that's where the safe harbor is going to apply to those no responses. No data, it could be due to a number of reasons, but most likely it's going to be due to the fact that your consent date is prior to the date that these carriers began tracking these numbers. So, if you give a consent date of January 1st of 2020, you're going to get a no data back because they have no way of knowing if that number has been permanently disconnected since that date. So some of the numbers and statistics we've seen in regards to the R&D, as far as the changes last year, from January, we saw about 184 million telephone numbers in that database. And by the end of the year, that had grown to 288 million. They're adding about 9.5 million new permanently disconnected numbers per month to the database. And there's approximately 13 million numbers a month of existing numbers that are permanently disconnecting for a subsequent time, right? So those don't cause the database to grow, but rather that the date changes associated with an existing number. So, if I permanently disconnected today, and then 6 months later, Danny ends up with the telephone number, and then he permanently disconnects, that date is going to get updated there. Next, we'll just talk about queries of the database for the entire year. In January, you saw that there were 11 million queries of the database, and in December, that number had grown to almost 50 million, so almost five-fold increase in queries per month. Saw about 338 million, total queries of the database for the year. In that last bullet there, you'll see how it breaks down. About 71% were no responses, so those were callable, right? Whereas about 5% were not callable, receiving a yes response, and then about 24% received a no data response. I think all that being said, I'll turn it over to Danny.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. And thanks everyone for taking the time here today. So now that Kevin's kind of given some background on the R&D itself and how that impacts organizations like yours, we'll really jump into talking about how Possible Now can solution for that. So we will start with our DNC solution. So I know many of you on the call today may be familiar with DNC solution, but if you're not familiar with DNC solution, it stands for Do Not Contact. And we talk about contact because it is a multi-channel tool. So it's not just the phone channel. It does help with identifying, phone numbers for text messaging purposes, as well as email addresses and mailing addresses. So companies really have one place to go for all of their consumer contact compliance requirements. The way that companies can access DNC solution is through our web interface. So that's an interactive area for you to log into and scrub your data against these relevant lists that are out there, but also putting in the right tools in place so that you can really leverage the reporting aspects of DNC solutions so that you can really reach your position of safe harbor. You can also access DNC solution through SFTP for high volume batch scrubbing, and as well as our APIs. So we have a full set of RESTful APIs that can help companies do real-time integrations to things like dialers or CRM systems and systems like that where you might need a real-time checking capability. When we talk to companies about DNC solution, it's not just about number scrubbing. It's also making sure that companies have the right record keeping and reporting in place really to create that defensible position. So there are safe harbor components within DNC solution that companies can leverage so that you can not just comply today, but also prove it tomorrow. So things like maintaining your company specific do not call list, providing training to your employees, as well as other safe harbor components, really helping companies bolster their compliance posture. So, really as it relates to the safe harbor components of DNC solution, we can talk about R&D. So of course, R&D has a safe harbor component, and we've integrated the FCC's reassigned number database into DNC solution. So in DNC solution, you'll be able to check your numbers against these relevant do not contact lists at a state and federal level, as well as identify wireless numbers appropriately, but also identifying numbers that are on the reassigned number database and how you should manage those moving forward. So you can access the R&D, again, through our APIs. We have a full set of RESTful APIs for you to check your numbers against, but you can also access it through high volume batch scrubbing through the web interface or through SFTP as well. And one of the things that I know Kevin talked about was making sure that you have reporting in place. So within DNC solution, you'll also be able to report on the numbers that you put through our system and the result of those phone numbers against the R&D's, yes, no, and no data. And you'll also be able to track how many records that you have submitted to the R&D so that you can keep track of that to see if you're well under your allotment or if you need to upgrade to a new allotment with the R&D. We audit that as well. And then really as it relates to pricing for the reassigned number database, everyone's familiar with the R&D pricing that's published on the website. We just have a 10% processing fee that's on top of that so that companies can leverage R&D scrubbing right through DNC solution as well. The other solution that we'll talk about for R&D and identifying numbers that have been disconnected and reassigned is a product that we've had in place for a really long time, helping companies really before the FCC's R&D database existed. So we have a product called mobile scoring. And if you remember back to what Kevin was talking about, the R&D looks at consent date and as well as the phone number. And for some companies, they might have phone numbers that they've captured well before January of 2021 that they need to identify if those numbers have been disconnected and reassigned. And so mobile scoring can help companies do that. So we can use mobile scoring for, phone numbers that go all the way back to 2012, so that you can status those phone numbers and see if they've been reassigned before or after the January 2021 date for the R&D. The response that we provide is a little bit different than the R&D's response. We have 4 different responses, A, D, E, and F. So A meaning it has not been reassigned, D being that it has been reassigned, E meaning that it could be from a prepaid type burner phone where that data doesn't exist. And then F meaning that you submitted a landline phone number. So the mobile scoring process is really designed for wireless numbers specifically, not necessarily landline numbers. It's also important to note here that, again, mobile scoring has been in place for a really long time. This is not something where Safe Harbor does apply, but it does help companies do their due diligence to identify those numbers before January of 2021 that may have been disconnected and reassigned to a new person. So that is really it from a solution overview perspective that we wanted to talk about. And I know we're going to flip it back to Eric for questions.
Kevin and Danny, thanks for your insights today. If anyone has any questions you would like to ask, please use the chat pane to send us those. And as a reminder, we will be sending out the presentation at the end of the webinar. So let's get started on the first few questions. Kevin, this one's for you. And the question is, so is there no safe harbor for any consents we have prior to January 2021?
That's right. So the only way that you're going to be able to seek safe harbor under this rule is that if you're actively using the reassigned number database and you receive a no response back from the R&D, meaning that the R&D said that there was a call that could be made. And there was just an error in the database. So, for any consents that you're going to have prior to the date that the R&D began, I mean, you're basically just consider yourself in the same boat on those particular phone numbers as if you weren't using the R&D at all, basically.
Great. Thank you. Danny, I'll throw this one to you. Are companies running all of their phone data through the R&D every month?
So companies aren't putting all of their data, their phone data, through the R&D every month. What we're seeing within the customers that are using R&D today is they're doing it they're really running data that they plan to call or text within a 30 to 45 day period, and then they're just running that data through, not all of the data that they have within their database, because that would really lead to really excessive spending. If you're not planning to call or text that phone number, you don't necessarily need to know if it's been reassigned. So just making sure that you're checking numbers that you do call or text, if it's been reassigned or not.
Great. And Kevin, I think this one probably is suited for either one of you, but why don't you take it? What's the recommended frequency of scrubbing? No. I'm sorry, the question's flipped on me. What kind of take rate thus far are you seeing from your clients?
I think early on, the R&D was pretty new when it first came out. And there wasn't a lot of historical data, so we weren't seeing a huge take rate by our clients. However, as there's now have more and more historical data in there, and plaintiffs are getting more and more creative. I think that we're going to see a lot more people taking it up, just like we have been as of recently, which the numbers showed, right, on the usage of the R&D, how much it's increased over time.
Thanks, Kevin. Danny, there's a follow-up question for you related to the one that you just answered. What is the recommended frequency of scrubbing against the R&D?
Yep. So we're seeing every 30 to 45 days. I think the reason why companies are doing it every 30 days is it's really just in line with their do not call requirements. And then the 45 days is really coming from, and Kevin, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, that if a number is permanently disconnected, it has to stay that status for at least 45 days. And so companies are checking every 45 days just because of that requirement to be in that status for 45 days. Is that right, Kevin?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, if a number were to become disconnected, it has to be disconnected for 45 days. So if you check a number today and you find out that it's not been disconnected, then there's really no point in checking it again for the next 45 days.
Yeah.
Great. And it looks like that's all the questions for now. So to learn more or to sign up for Possible Now's R&D service, contact us at info@possiblenow.com, or you can call us at the number on the screen. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today.